right, I think we can go ahead and kick things off. I'd like to first start off by welcoming everyone and thanking you all for joining our first veteran-focused event hosted by the New York State Health Foundation this year. My name is Derek Coy, and I'm the Veterans Health Officer here at the New York State Health Foundation. Joining me for a conversation about addressing the health needs of women veterans is the one and only Andrea Goldstein, who is not only a senior policy advisor for the Women Veterans Task Force in the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Veterans Affairs, but also serves as a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Navy Reserves and is a friend of the foundation. So Andrea, we'd like to welcome you back to our Conversation with series, and thank you so much for joining us today. It's greatly appreciated.
Thanks for having me back, Derek. It's great to be here.
So it's Women's History Month. So for the folks that don't know, women have played an integral role in our nation's military, literally from its founding. You can go back and look at some amazing examples like Harriet Tubman, later an Auburn, New York resident, who was the first woman to lead an armed military operation in the United States. Dr. Mary E. Walker, who was a Medal of Honor recipient, which of course is our nation's highest award for valor in combat. The women of the 688 are a great example, the only all-Black, all-female battalion that served overseas during World War II. And of course, Deborah Sampson, who disguised herself as a man and fought in the Revolutionary War. She was shot in the thigh amongst other wounds and pulled a projectile out herself. Amazing person, was honorably discharged, received a military pension. So these are some, but not even close to being all of the contributions women have made to our nation's military. But I'd like to focus on that latter example of Deborah Sampson. Her story is always relevant when discussing the role women have played in the military, but especially during Women's History Month, and even more so considering a bill named after her was signed into law early January, the reason we're here today. So quickly, before I get out of Andrea's way and I let the audience hear from the Oracle herself, we have some time for Q&A, hopefully after this conversation. So please send those questions into the chat box throughout the event, and we'll certainly get to as many as we can. And I'll go ahead and dive right in now. Andrea, the House Veterans Affairs Committee called the Deborah Sampson Act the largest women veterans package in over a decade. So can you provide an overview of what's in the bill and explain a few things about it that you think are important in particular?
Yes, absolutely. The original bill as it passed the House was more than 40 pages long. So there's quite a bit in there. Okay. It creates the Office of Women's Health, which elevates some existing positions that were already existing and puts them into a single office that reports directly to the Undersecretary for Health. It makes that office responsible for a number of reports, including looking at where women veterans are getting their health care and the number of providers that we have. And the bill also looks at the retrofit initiatives to retrofit existing facilities for this rapidly growing population of women veterans. Women veterans are the fastest growing population of veterans. There are currently 2 million living women veterans. About a quarter of them currently use VA for their healthcare. And nationwide, this is a population that is growing, where the male veteran population is shrinking. So the women veteran population is only going to get bigger and bigger, and VA needs to meet those needs. The Deborah Sampson Act also has a comprehensive requirement for VA to establish an anti-sexual harassment, anti-sexual assault policy. It creates multiple accountability mechanisms, reporting mechanisms, and also quite significantly involves the Veteran Service Organization community, the VSO community, in the development and implementation of those policies, because we cannot do any of this work without our VSO partners. The bill also provides legal services for women veterans. It has significant reforms for survivors of military sexual trauma, to include opening vet centers to former members of the Reserve and Guard who experienced military sexual trauma when, for example, on state orders. There was an existing gap in treatment authority for VA. And so we worked, that VA pointed out to us. And so we worked with them to fix that. So there's a lot in there, but those are some of the components that I think are some of the most monumental.
Gotcha. And it sounds so, and it's one of the few things I would say these days in general that's encouraging. You hear the response to what advocates, so many folks like yourself, have really raised the alarm about. So that's encouraging, and fortunately we will be able to dive into a few of those in greater detail. I'd like to quickly first shout out Kristen Rouse, one of the amazing folks in New York State's Division of Veteran Services. They hosted an event last week focusing on very similar issues with yourself and other incredible women leaders. And a central theme of the event was the phrase "perseverance got it done," which I appreciate, which is of course referring to the efforts taken to get the Deborah Sampson Act passed. So these issues, if you talk to anyone like yourself in the space, they're not necessarily new. And I'd like to think more folks now than in at least recent memory understand the importance of the needs of women veterans. So my next question is why did it actually take so long to get this bill passed?
There are a number of reasons. And on the issue of perseverance, I want to make two shout outs. First of all, Kristen Ross and I worked together on a number of issues, including, if we're talking about famous New York women veterans, renaming the Manhattan VA after Margaret Corbin, who's the other woman Revolutionary War veteran. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, we passed on like the very last day of session. Okay. Really last minute got that over the finish line. Mm-hmm. And there's a provision in the Deborah Sampson Act on ensuring that there are prosthetics for women veterans that have the gender specific prosthetics, and studying that issue and ensuring that women have the, if you want to wear high heels, for example, and have the right kind of prosthetics. That was a recommendation that was made in 1998 by the Advisory Committee on Women Veterans at VA. So okay. Some of these provisions took a really long time. Why did this bill take so long? There are two reasons. First of all, I really cannot discount who was in control and who had the gavel. Sure. In both the House and the Senate. While this was a strongly bipartisan bill, it was introduced with Republican co-sponsors. It was introduced by Democrats with Republican co-sponsors at the time. Mm-hmm. But it was championed by a Democratic majority. Mm-hmm. And that does matter. Women veterans have certainly been prioritized and championed by both parties, but the Democrats gaining control of the House meant there was an establishment in 2018, meant that the Women Veterans Task Force was established, how I got a job. And it meant that significantly more resources were put behind prioritizing this. During that time, so that's on the one side. On the other side, veteran service organizations also increasingly prioritized women veterans. There's some organizations like Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America, Disabled Veterans of America, who had women veterans in their top priorities for several years, but other organizations took a little bit more time to get there. Then there are also some wonky issues that I would say. The issue of the VA motto and changing the VA motto to be gender inclusive was seen as a somewhat of a lightning rod previously. When the bill was introduced in the 115th Congress, it was taken out of the bill in the 116th Congress. And for most of the 116th Congress, the issue of the motto was not something that legislators wanted to actively talk about. And then a number of issues happened in early 2020 that constituted a complete sea change. So at this point now, today, there are a lot more legislators who are behind making the VA motto more gender inclusive. And for those who don't know, the current motto was not statutorily authorized. It was a previous VA administrator who just decided that he liked Lincoln's words from his second inaugural address taken out of context for him who bore the battle and his widow and his orphan, even though by this point, Dr. Mary Walker, who's from Oswego, New York, had already done the things that got her the Medal of Honor in 1866. So this is a very roundabout way of saying legislative support, VSO support, and that there was also a sea change there was a provision in the bill that was controversial in the original version that was taken out and then passed the House on its own in the 116th Congress.
Got you. I appreciate that breakdown. It's one of the great things about having a conversation with you is, the thorough understanding of all these nuances. It's not as easy as just reading the bill, just getting a bill passed. It's really coalition building and all these things. And I appreciate we already got some questions coming in, which is great. And someone did mention Kristen Rouse is the best of the best, and we were able to fact check that, and that's actually true. So that's awesome. Appreciate that comment. My next question is the Deborah Sampson Act. Its passage is, of course, great, and we're looking at the things that you mentioned that are in it. But it definitely, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's part of the larger Isaacson-Roe bill, I believe. So are there other things in the Isaacson-Roe bill that impact women veterans, or was everything consolidated into this, or is a little bit of both? Can you kind of unpack that a bit for us?
Yes. So the way we got all of the women veteran legislation, all the veteran legislation that got passed into law, there's a lot that passed the House, and there are a couple that passed the House that didn't pass the Senate. There are 3 provisions that passed in two suicide prevention bills that were related to the Women Veterans Call Center, and some mental health related provisions. So that didn't end up in the final version because they became law elsewhere.
Mhm.
There was a provision on expanding maternity, the number of days that newborns are covered. So if you're a veteran and you are covered by VA for maternity care, your newborn is covered for it was previously 7 days, now it's 7 days plus medically necessary. That was in the National Defense Authorization Act.
Okay.
And then the Deborah Sampson Act did have a component on newborn care on emergency transportation, but there was so one of the very first things that I wanted to work on when I came to work on the Hill was what was at the time a program that was started by some very intrepid Air Force officers called, that was at the time the Air Force Women's Health Transition Training Pilot Program. That's what it was called at the end of 2018 and going into 2019.
Okay.
And we asked for a briefing on it. I think I started working here in March, and I think we asked for a briefing on it in April. Mm-hmm. And so over time, between the fact that that program was great and a lot of congressional attention, VA and the DoD worked together to make that program permanent. They did it on their own. But we also authorized it in statute, and it passed both in the FY20 NDAA and in HR 7185 in that bill. So there was one section that was not in the Deborah Sampson section that served women veterans, and it pertains to the Women's Health Transition Program. And in addition to authorizing it, also has some reporting requirements so we can understand what its impact is.
Gotcha. So for my next question, I think there's one presidential candidate in particular, historically, I remember they were asked, kind of what are you going to do for the African-American community? And the first and sometimes only thing a lot of folks like this bring up is criminal justice reform. And of course, the criminal justice system has an incredibly negative and disproportionate effect on the African-American community. Mm-hmm. But of course, the needs of the community are much more expansive. And so you don't want to like pigeonhole one, population into associating them with one issue. But we understand that it does impact them. And I feel the same way about military sexual trauma in the women veterans community. There's so many things that, women veterans you need as far as like resources and support, but then you can't deny the fact that MST has this largely negative and incredibly disproportionate effect on women veterans. So with the understanding that, of course, this is not the only issue, and you've highlighted so many more, but to speak to what is, certainly a scourge, but also an incredibly impactful issue with military sexual trauma. Can you speak to, one, the severity of it, and then two, the impact it has on women veterans?
Yes. So, serving in the military you need to be really clear. Women are not the only, men experience military sexual trauma as well. Women are disproportionately affected. I think last year's report found that 63% of currently serving members, it was a very high disproportionate number of those who are currently serving who are survivors of sexual assault, because military sexual trauma is a VA definition that includes sexual assault, sexual abuse, and sexual harassment. DOD separates their definitions, but found that 63% of those who had experienced military sexual assault in the last year were women. So considering that women are about a fifth of the force, that is an insane number.
Absolutely.
When you add in harassment, there's just, you cannot serve as a woman in the military and not experience sexual harassment. Even if you don't experience it, you know that you are living in an environment where it is pervasive, where the threat is constantly there, and you are living in a constantly threatening environment from people who are supposed to have your back. And so in addition to it being and the absolutely most destructive issue in the military, because all of the current destructive issues we're getting back to are there's a core tenet of them, which is this culture of violent misogyny. And so if that's your experience when you're serving, why are you going to trust another government system that, and this is also certainly my experience. I mean, I thought of VA as just being similar to DOD.
Sure.
Why are you going to trust that system? How are you going to know that that system actually, like, VA has the best MST treatment in the world. It has pioneered various mental health treatments because of treating veterans for military sexual trauma. But accessing that care is challenging because the rate of sexual harassment at VA facilities is approximately 25%. The study that came from, the range was 12 to 43%, depending on the facility you were looking at. So depending on what facility you go to, it might be that half of women are experiencing harassment. So it's very difficult to change culture through legislation, because ultimately that's what this is. This is about it's about valuing some veterans more than others and devaluing the safety of some veterans. But in addition to the additional care and treatment for military sexual trauma that the Deborah Sampson Act provides, a very significant portion of the segment on addressing sexual harassment and sexual assault at VA is going to require VA and the veteran service organizations to participate in an iterative process that I am hopeful will ultimately change culture.
Yeah, there's so many times I want to hit the little hand clapping emoji to keep it up, because everything you said, there's just so many great points, and we could literally do a deep dive into almost every single point that you made, because one, they're incredibly important, but two, also very complex. And it kind of, you answered a little bit of my next question was, you mentioned some things about what VA is doing very well in regards to MST, as far as just the industry standard, let alone just in VA, and what the Deborah Sampson Act has done. Is there anything else in the act that you've seen that that does create better support or address this issue in a different way, or is that more or less the comprehensive approach that you mentioned?
I think it's a comprehensive approach. I would really encourage people to take a look at that section of the Deborah Sampson Act. There's a lot there. I mean, everything from requiring standardized reporting that's going to require VA to make significant inroads in reforming their IT systems, because right now there's a lot of if data is being collected, it's like not even going anywhere. So and we've spoken to them since the bill passed, and they're working on that issue. But I would also highlight, before I forget, sometimes the biggest reforms, when they come out in legislation, look really wonky and technical.
Yeah.
And it could be as much as saying, we actually did change the definition of military sexual trauma. We struck the word repeated from Title 38. Title 38 defined sexual harassment as being repeated experiences of, if someone catcalls you once, it's harassment. So some of the changes that are in there are as much as the equivalent of taking a pen and doing that in the law.
Gotcha. So in regards to VA in particular, the VA's Women Task Force put out a report showing that women's usage of VA healthcare had doubled in just a decade. And that report's a little dated now, but we continue to see women serve in record numbers. Nearly 350,000 have deployed since 9/11. And the veteran community is, as you had mentioned previously, comprised of nearly 2 million women veterans. So we're seeing VA and, women usage up at VA. So to start on a positive note, with some foreshadowing about perhaps the negative to come, what do you think it is about VA that's attracting that many women veteran patients, and kind of what's working, if anything, or anything that you could speak on in regards to those two questions?
I mean, free, comprehensive, free or low cost, because some people are paying copays, free or low cost, integrated healthcare that is culturally competent, we hope, culturally competent, with a unique understanding of the needs of women veterans who, in proportion to the overall population, is not particularly big. There's no, I also have Kaiser. I never use it because I have to explain all of this other stuff about my service that is just understood if I go to VA.
Sure.
Or, right, and for understanding the unique health risks. Like my Kaiser primary care provider is not going to think, oh, you're in your mid-30s and you were exposed to various toxins and the risk of breast cancer in women veterans is higher at a lower age. So like a lot of women veterans are getting mammograms at a younger age than they would in the private sector, because there's this system that is set up to ask those questions. So it's great. And the Women's Health Transition Training Program, the DoD, this basically an extra day of TAP for women veterans that I mentioned earlier, was started because there is an Air Force officer who transitioned off of active duty, went into the reserves. And then when she started using VA, this is great. No one told me about this. They do maternity care. I can get like Lamaze classes through VA. What? So it's more women are learning about this and finding out that it's pretty, when it works, it's pretty great. You just need to like not be harassed going through the door. There's definitely an if you build it, they will come phenomenon. In 1 year, my boss and I visited 22 VA facilities, and there's only one that I can think of, which is Albany, New York. And I mean, this might be outdated now, but at the time, it was the only facility in the country that had managed the balance of space, having enough space and having enough staff. Most either had not enough staff, not enough space, or both. And the providers were fully impaneled and they couldn't grow. And then every time we saw a facility grow, have more space and more staff, they would become fully impaneled again, because more women veterans were using that. And so that's a challenge that we're really trying to address, because women veterans who do use VA healthcare tend to be very satisfied with it. And a conversation that I've had with a lot of women, and this is certainly my experience, is my options are go to a private physician who's going to charge me a lot more money and have absolutely no understanding of this incredibly important experience in my life that impacts my health, or see someone who might save my life because they have that understanding and possibly get harassed walking through the door. So if we can deal with that harassment issue, right, it's not a contest.
No, I mean, I feel bad laughing because it's the way you bring it up. It's so sad. It's like, if only we can get through what I would say predominantly is not VA, and definitely correct me if I'm wrong, it's other vets at VA that are doing the harassing. It's not like, usually staff members or your doctors. So I'm not giving a blanket, statement against any of those. But from what I understand, it's, vets that are sitting in, the waiting rooms, and they're the ones doing this. It's in a VA facility, but it's not like VA is perpetuating. But of course, like you mentioned, if that's the culture there, they're doing nothing to change the culture. And Josh Pittman wrote "Culture Eats Strategy for Breakfast." Record quote, which it's so true, and I definitely agree with that. And I think, to kind of flip it again with that almost, the foreshadowing almost, the one thing we do here at the foundation, and certainly would like to see other folks do, is instead of talking about populations, we like to talk with populations. So we know it's an incredibly diverse space, and the importance of hearing from someone that's experienced it. You mentioned you have Kaiser, but you predominantly use VA. What has your experience, like Andrea Goldstein's experience, been? And you can answer that in however you feel is appropriate. But what has your experience personally been at VA throughout the course of you being a veteran?
So I started going to, I've used 4 VA facilities as a patient. I used Jamaica Plain in Boston, West Roxbury in the Boston area, Albany, New York, and then Washington, D.C. And I still use Albany. And Boston was great. It was great. Never had an issue with harassment. There were a couple of times where it was really a little bit frustrating. There were some circumstances where I felt uncomfortable, but it was very easy to avoid. Okay. It was just like older male vets congregating, but the way that the facility was actually configured was it was very easy to avoid. They had kind of like their hangout area, and I could avoid it. And there were some challenges with some of the waiting areas because the women's clinic there flooded in 2015. This was 2016, 2017, 2016 to 2018 when I was there. It flooded. So they had to keep moving wherever the women's clinic was. So it was a temporary solution. And they kept improving, and they've now reopened a huge women's clinic. But it was great. I mean, I had a health issue when I left active duty that like no one could figure out for a year. And within 3 months of getting to VA, they figured it out, and it's largely treated, and it's been mostly a nothing burger because VA figured it out really easily and treated it. Yeah. Same with getting enrolled in mental health. I didn't use VA mental health for the first year, and then I had basically a breakdown my second year of grad school. I was like, I need help. And they saw me right away, like triaged me that day, and eventually very quickly got me with healthcare. And then when I moved back to New York, they transferred me very quickly. They transferred my records and everything, and my care, and getting a new provider before I left Boston. It was a little more challenging coming to DC, but once I got enrolled in care, it was great. I have no complaints about my healthcare. I've had one incident in 5 years now, almost 5 years of using VA, where I had a doctor who was like belittling my pain. And I would be, this is an issue in medicine.
Exactly. That's really
not that, right? This is an issue in medicine. So I wouldn't blame that particular issue on VA. I would blame that on sexism in medicine. I mean, it's been great. My issues have been like the guy with a walker at the bus outside the DC VA who was like, "Hey, pretty lady." I don't have time. Don't have time for this. Okay. So if we can fix that, everything else is, I don't want to, like, there are challenges. This is a rapidly growing population. This is an institution that was created for men, and still majority serves older men. But that proportion is going to increasingly be the inverse. So we have to work to plan ahead for that. I don't want to say I have nothing but good things to say about VA healthcare, but having also used private healthcare, like, I'm pretty happy with this, like, generally high functioning socialized system. The other thing to highlight is because VA is a public system, it is subject to oversight. And it is subject to transparency that, like, Kaiser or Cleveland Clinic or, NYU Langone, sorry if anyone hears from NYU, I don't need to pick on you, I just wanted to give a local example, that they're not subject to that oversight. like my job is also to go in with a flashlight and like look in the nooks and crannies for what's wrong with it, because so it's subject to that oversight. And so I don't want to say that some of the bad things that you heard aren't true. They are. We know about them in part because the system is subject to oversight in a way that private systems are not.
Mm-hmm. No, and that's such a good point. And one, I appreciate you sharing that, because like discussing your own personal like health journey, that's super personal. You know, it's something that it varies for a lot of folks. So one, I appreciate you sharing that. And two, of course, because of who you are, your expertise, it goes a lot of way for folks just hearing it in general, but then also to learn more, you know, objectively about these systems. And two, I think the point that you make about, you know, being held accountable at VA, it reminds me of Suzanne Gordon. She's a great journalist that writes a lot about VA. And she makes that point that if something happens at the Cleveland Clinic, they'll probably settle and you'll sign an NDA and you'll never hear about it. If it happens at a VA, you can call your senator and people can look into it. And there's a big difference between those two systems. I do wonder, our CEO, Dr. David Sandman, he does a blog every month. And whenever there's a new VA secretary, he'll offer one of his blogs for advice to the new VA secretary. So if you get a chance, I do recommend you all check it out. It's pretty solid. But if we could kind of flip it, Andrea, if you were to say right now, you know, you get to tell the VA secretary, you know, what you think should be prioritized, and you have advice for him in this new role, what's some advice that you would give him?
Prioritizing safe and welcoming VA. I mean, we've certainly already talked about harassment, sexism.
Sure.
There have been some horrifying instances of racism within VA, within the women veterans population. These two things go in hand, because the women veteran population is close to half non-white. We're getting very close to that, and it's about 30% Black. So I would be remiss if I did not highlight that it should be explicit, not implicit, but sometimes I forget to highlight that. But the secretary did put in his very first welcome message, talk about safe and welcoming VA, and not just for patients, but for employees. You did point out that a lot of the issues of harassment are perpetrated by other vets. And there are employees who are in very difficult situations where they're being harassed by the people they're trying to help. Mm-hmm. So, and there certainly are issues with employees also being perpetrators, but there's a well-established mechanism for addressing that. This is a system that deals with the public and interfaces with the public in a very unique way. And so addressing those cultural issues, which have these then, you know, real health impact and an impact on people's economic opportunity and benefits access, that's absolutely top of mind.
Gotcha.
And I haven't directly told the secretary that, but you know, working where I do, we've had the opportunity to work together on sending letters and sharing feedback. And it was really reassuring, like I said, that Secretary McDonough put out that statement day one, and that his first visit was the DC VA, where he took a white ribbon pledge, which is VA's anti-violence campaign, outside the women's clinic.
Nice. So I appreciate you sharing that as well. And I think certainly great advice, of course, and hoping, you know, something to that effect does come to fruition. And you brought this next topic up, which I appreciate because I think is very relevant. So of course, VA is not by any means the sole provider of healthcare to women veterans. Not only do a lot choose private providers for myriad practical reasons, but also the passage of the Mission Act, which allows VA to purchase more private care. It's a long, you know, way of addressing long wait times at VA. I bring this up not only because did we commission a study with RAND that showed about 3% of private providers in New York are ready to provide high quality cultural competent care to veterans, but also a really troubling GAO report just came out, and it revealed that some providers that should be ineligible for participating in VA's community care program are not being weeded out. So you could basically not be eligible to provide healthcare, but you're in these networks. So basically a veteran can go to a provider that, one, is certainly not culturally competent, like you mentioned, not aware of burn pit exposure, toxic exposure, all the things that you might experience in the military. And yet a lot of veterans go there. So VA can only do so much. My question is, what could be done about those private providers to make sure that they are at least on par with what VA does, or could at least just be better about addressing the needs of veterans in particular, but women in particular as well?
Yeah, the Deborah Sampson Act did have a number of provisions that specifically provided a oversight and accountability, but also training and training modules. Like you
Sure.
should have to do training to serve this very specific population. So that was something that was very much in the realm of the possible for us that we got over the finish line. And we have seen overall most women who were already using VA just continue to use VA, not going into the community. Certainly where I live in upstate New York, people will go to the community for stuff like podiatry, stuff that's a lot closer for them.
Mm-hmm.
But especially when you get into more rural areas, in a lot of cases, the closest and fastest care is still going to be at VA.
Mm-hmm.
That was certainly the case for me. And the one time I experimented going into the community, it took 3 times as long as it would have been to be seen at VA. So.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And again, good to hear, because we know just so many vets use private care. I mean, it's just the nature of the beast for, a variety of different reasons. My next question, and you touched on this already a little bit, the idea of women veterans. Of the women veterans, how many are women of color? How many are of different ethnicities? I heard an interesting take, if you will, that we say things like the African American community as if it's a literal community. When you look at African Americans in the United States, and whether they're, wealthy, low income, whether they live in a certain geographic region, there's all different things that make them unique, as we all are. So it was kind of making the case that saying a community is a misnomer. And I thought about that, like the veteran community is super duper diverse. I mean, there's certainly demographics that you could look at that might be a majority in some instances, but are we kind of maybe doing a disservice by saying things like the veteran community, when really we should be talking about women veterans? And when we're talking about women veterans, should we be saying African American or Indigenous women veterans? Is there anything on that you could speak to, you feel is relevant?
I think there are some times where we can refer to the veteran community because there are certain dynamics and certain things. Like, I mean, the previous president called veterans suckers and losers. Like, I think that's something that a lot of veterans, regardless of demographics, regardless of branch of service, time in service, gender, race, ethnicity, we're all like, that is something that I'm not going to say on a recorded conversation, but unacceptable.
Sure.
But then within the community, there actually are a lot of frustrations about, I think there are times where it's really important to talk about Black women veterans specifically, or Indigenous women veterans specifically. A lot of women feel like, and younger vets and minority veterans feel that some of the older veteran service organizations don't speak for them and aren't welcoming, or a particular post might be welcoming, but the organization isn't, or my experience personally with is, I won't name names, but in my town, I'm a member of 2 different veteran service organizations. One of them, the local post, is very welcoming, but the national organization has a little bit of work to do regarding women veterans. Mm-hmm. The other one, the post, is hostile, but the national organization has been doing a progressively better job on serving women and minority veterans. So and then within, I will absolutely say there are dynamics amongst women veterans, and the fact that there are women veterans groups tend to be more local, where there's been some infighting to manage because of, a lot of them are run by white women officers who may not, or are perceived as not speaking for 30% or more of the veteran population. And so one of the biggest challenges that I've had is managing these dynamics and trying to make sure that everyone has a seat at the table and playing musical chairs to say, like, okay, well, some people are going to get to be here this time and some are going to be backbench this time, and also working with communities that have been historically left out and marginalized and traumatized by other vets. So it's really important to understand that there are these challenges within this community because some of us have been harmed by people we serve with.
No, thank you for sharing that. It's, I think, a great breakdown of such a complex topic and issue. So I really appreciate that. In similar vein, my personal belief, I really do believe trans women are women, like hard stop. And I think that's another population when we're talking about women veterans. Are there specific things that we're looking at for trans veterans when we're looking at these larger bills like Deborah Sampson? Are there, of course, there's so much more to be done, but can you just kind of speak to maybe what's been done so far and kind of what we can do to address folks that are in the service that are trans?
Yes, so I'll focus on the VA side of this equation. It's important to highlight, like, VA is providing some really, VA is providing, I don't want to say it is providing culturally competent care. That's not my personal experience. Like, I don't know, but VA is providing much more culturally competent care than is widely available outside of VA. VA also will, if you want to be seen, if you identify as a woman and you want to be seen at the women's clinic, you will be seen at the women's clinic.
Mm-hmm.
That's just what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So VA, I ask this question on every site visit, which is where are people getting their healthcare based on their gender identity? And the answer is where they want to be seen. And have heard some really interesting stories about some residential treatment programs where there were transgender women who were early transition and were in a women's program, and some transphobia on behalf of some of their cisgender women who were in the program, and how that was actually a very common dynamic and how the programs were managing that. Mm-hmm. So I want to highlight that there's a lot that's already going on. There is a ban currently on gender confirmation surgery. VA does provide hormones and endocrinology, but there is currently a ban on gender confirmation surgery. That can be repealed through executive action. And Secretary McDonough did announce a comprehensive review of LGBTQ policies, okay, both serving veterans and serving employees. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot here that can be accomplished through executive action. Regarding LGBTQ veterans in general, there is a huge data shortfall. Mm-hmm. Huge data shortfall. And my boss, Chairman Takano, introduced a bill earlier this week that would establish a commission to identify some of these issues. And there's a lot we can do in general on data collection that we've been talking about on our end. But one of our biggest challenging in serving LGBTQ veterans is there's a lot we don't know because the data has never been collected.
Yeah, that's a good point. And again, I think one of maybe the few encouraging things is, VA with their Million Veterans program, the research that are done, their scope, they're arguably the largest provider of LGBT or healthcare to the LGBTQ community. So that's incredibly important. I know we definitely want to be mindful of your time. You're like maybe one of the busiest people on the Hill. So we're glad we have you for an hour. But our attendees have just been sending in the questions, a lot of friends of ours. So I'm excited to get to a few of them. Just to kick it off, our friend Sam Kubek at NILAG, who is an amazing person, leader, advocate in this space. And I recommend folks check her out. She mentions now that the DSA is signed into law. What do you think is the number one priority that remains to be addressed for women veterans? And what do we look to for what lies ahead?
Reproductive health. Okay. I don't want to say the main priority. It's the main priority that we wanted to get to that we didn't make any laws about last Congress. For veterans who pay co-pays, they still have to pay a copay for their contraception, which that means that women veterans and the uninsured are the only women who pay co-pays for their contraception. There's still a lot that we could do regarding addressing maternal mortality and morbidity in the veteran population and racial and ethnic disparities there. Right now, we don't know preliminary research thus far, some data that we got from VA, actually, it looks like women veterans are doing better, which is a significant finding in itself. But again, if we don't have the research and the data, we don't know. Yeah. VA also has the most restrictive abortion ban in the federal government. Providers can't even provide non-directive counseling, and no services are covered whatsoever in any circumstances, not even the circumstances that are currently permitted to be covered by federal funding. So again, those two, abortion counseling and abortion services, those issues can be addressed through executive action by the secretary. And then finally, infertility. A colleague of mine is our lead on working on issues of infertility, but VA's current infertility coverage for IVF does disproportionately harm women veterans because it requires that a service connection be established. And since women are more likely to have infertility with unknown cause, it's a lot harder to establish that service connection. And the current policy excludes same-sex couples and unmarried women. So there's still quite a bit of work that we can do, either legislatively or through our oversight in continuing to remind the secretary that he has the power to do stuff that we can do.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And definitely from my very unscientific polling, but just being in the space and talking to different folks, issues with, I think IVF in particular is something that I hear all the time. And it seems to be always something. So hopefully we can, see more, efforts leading on that front. Another question, I'm not sure if you all are familiar with Beth Kabbalah, but she is with the Veterans Legal Clinic at Syracuse University. And same thing there, tremendous work, really great folks over there. I highly recommend checking them out. And she mentions kind of the work they do there, and it comes around with the point that you made. As far as legal services go, what does that look like in general for women veterans? And then also with the Deborah Sampson Act, what are some things that are in there that might address legal challenges that women veterans face?
Yeah, so there's a section that would address the most significant homelessness challenges for women veterans. It's called Challenge for Women Veterans, that would provide legal services. And in addition to representation for the processing of claims, an issue that we've heard quite a bit about from women veterans is child custody, and concern of, if I'm homeless or precariously housed, will I lose my kids? If I seek mental health treatment, will I lose my kids? And a lot of women who are also in some pretty awful custody battles with abusive spouses or abusive partners. And so the legal services issue would, being able to provide legal services to women veterans for some of those specific issues is hopefully something that this bill will help us accomplish.
Gotcha. Another thing, I think this you might chalk this one up to the category of a question about culture, if you will, because audience member Lily kind of asked the idea that, brings up the point that a lot of women didn't feel that they were veterans. One, because unfortunately, I'm sure a lot of people told them that they weren't for myriad reasons, unfortunately. But then also, this is something I've heard from other folks where women, their first identity, if you will, is not veteran. They might identify as something else, either as their gender, their race, they're a mom, whatever they do for work. And veteran usually isn't top on that list. So is there a way to, one, inform older veterans in particular who didn't see themselves as veterans because they were women, maybe they didn't serve in combat, you name all the reasons we've heard a few times. Is there a way to change that and maybe welcome in older women veterans, or just a better way of kind of letting folks know who are veterans and aren't? Because the question of, are you a veteran, is one of the most subjective things that you can ask. And that seems to still be a continuing pervasive problem.
Yeah, and the best way to ask the question is, have you ever served in the U.S. Armed Forces? And I mean, I would love to see advertising from VA that features older women, and their I Am Not Invisible campaign does feature some older women.
Mhm.
And thinking about when outreach is taking place, especially if it's going to be in a community with older vets, how is that outreach tailored to the fact that, yes, you might reach, okay, let's talk about older, because older pre-1972 women were about 2% of the armed forces, pre-1974 rather, pre all volunteer force. So let's say you go to an outreach event with 100 vets, chances are 100 people, and let's say all of them are veterans, chances are 2 of them are women. So and we want to support those women. You know, 11,000 women served in country in Vietnam. So about 50,000 during the Vietnam era. So constantly being aware that there are women who are eligible for this. And also another issue that is certainly near and dear to my heart, and I know my boss has introduced legislation on this, is openly acknowledging and talking about policies that harmed service women previously. From 1951 to 1975, women were just kicked out if you got pregnant, regardless of it. If you were pregnant, and unless someone, if you were pregnant and chose to stay pregnant, you were going to get kicked out, regardless of it. The pregnancy was planned, regardless if it was unplanned, regardless if it was unwanted, regardless if it was, you know, exciting, wonderful news with a spouse or subject to rape. You were kicked out. And supposedly it was waiverable, but DOD also didn't grant a waiver until like 1970. So basically the end of this policy.
Yeah.
Chances are a lot of those women do not have great associations with their service, and may have even been inadvertently rendered ineligible because of the way that they were discharged from the military. And so also openly acknowledging and talking about these policies and discrimination will also bring people out. And something that everyone can do in their community is work with the WIMSA, the Women in Military Service for America, the Women's Memorial, and the Veterans History Project, for, you know, do outreach, be that person doing that outreach in your community. Say, hey, I'm looking to speak with women who served during this era, and you'll find them.
Yeah, that's
I gave a talk at my synagogue a couple of years ago, and this like 89-year-old, 90-year-old woman came up to me, and she's like, "Oh, I was a Navy chief, World War II." What?
That's amazing. I love that. So again, we're running a little low on time. I want to be mindful of yours to kind of wrap things up a little bit. Because your expertise, you know, in the military, you have served, you continue to serve in the Navy. You're also, you know, expert in all things veterans related. So you're, you know, wealth of knowledge. So if a woman approaches you and says, Andrea, I'm going to be, you know, commissioned soon, or I'm going to be enlisted soon, I'm going to be in the military, what advice would you have for her?
Make friends with other women. Ignore people trying to pit you against each other. Make friends with other women, sponsor other women. Don't take it personally if some older women who are much more senior to you have a mean girl mentality. It was inculcated in them. And a lot of some folks who are even 10 years, 20 years ahead of me are breaking out of that. And have fun.
So similarly, now that woman has served, she's deployed, she's had an amazing career, she's decided she's ready to transition. You have someone that's now going to be a veteran. What advice would you give someone that's about to transition, a woman in particular that's about to transition out of the service and join the veteran community, if you will?
You earned and deserve the benefits. Apply for that disability, get your money. That money's yours, is your money.
Mhm.
If you don't get it, it's not like it's going to someone else.
Yep.
And it's the same with healthcare. It's not like you're taking a place from someone else. It's yours. And a lot of us have been, as women in general, and certainly as women in the military, have consistently been told that our service matters less, that our existence matters less, that we are not deserving and someone else deserves it more than us. No, it's yours. You are entitled to it. Go get it.
Awesome. I love that. And so I do, I can't recommend enough folks, follow you on social media, follow your career, all the things that you're doing. I highly recommend that they do that. And also, who are some folks that you'd like to shout out, either folks in the space doing good work or also organizations that folks can learn more about the issues that you've talked about or help change the culture in, you name it.
Yeah. So for shout outs, I'm trying to think. I don't know who's on this call because I would love to give shout outs to people who are on this call. We've already talked about Kristen Ross, Samantha Kubek, who I know are on the call.
Yep.
Pam Campos Palma has been really wonderful organizer to talk to about connecting with veterans who are not connected with any institution or organization, especially veterans of color. For there are some really amazing smaller organizations around the country. I'm excited to hear from the National Association of Black Military Women and Pink Berets in a couple of weeks. I also have to give a special shout out to the disabled American veterans who have represented me on years and years and years of claims. Also, I think there are a lot of folks here, some some county VSOs. County VSOs are amazing and integral, and I am so appreciative of the work that all of you do. For folks who are not aware of the county VSOs and are looking for veteran services and support, please use your county VSOs. So yes, those are some shout outs.
And awesome ones too. A lot of folks that, literally all of those folks I look to a lot and have learned a lot, and I'm honored to be in this space. We are running short on time now, so we're about to wrap up. I want to thank everyone, of course, who joined. Amazing group of audience members, and of course, Andrea. I mean this in like the most sincere way. I want to thank you for your service in the military. Afterwards, you helping out with this. So many folks, including myself, have the pleasure of learning from you and getting to see what you're doing and what you've been able to accomplish. So it truly is an honor. Hopefully, we could have done probably a deep dive on each of these topics. So would love to have you back, and hopefully we can do that. But want to thank you again, and I think we can go ahead and wrap up.
All right. Thank you so much for having me, Derek, and thanks everyone.
Of course. Everyone take care. Thanks for joining.